Captain Zekthara felt his 3 hearts beating faster as the emergency transmission crackled through the bridge speakers of his ship. The voice belonged to Admiral Veltos, and it carried the kind of fear that Zekthara had never heard from his superior before. The Kthmore had broken through 3 defensive lines in less than 2 standard days and were moving toward the populated systems with a speed that defied all tactical projections. The holographic display showed red markers, spreading across the star map like an infection. Each red dot represented a Kthmore war fleet, and there were more of them than Zekthara had ships under his command. The Coalition had fought the Kthmore before, but never like this, and never with such overwhelming numbers on the enemy side. Zekthara's communication officer looked up from her console with wide eyes. She was young for a Velnari, and this was her first real combat assignment. Her voice shook as she spoke about the incoming transmission from Coalition Command. The orders were simple but unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time ever, the Coalition was calling upon their newest members to join a major military operation. The humans were coming to help them fight. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stepped through the airlock of the Coalition vessel Starbreaker, and Zekthara got his first close look at a human warrior. Morrison was shorter than most Coalition species, but his movements had a controlled precision that reminded Zekthara of a hunting predator. His uniform was different from Coalition standard issue and covered in small pockets and attachment points for equipment that Zekthara did not recognize. Behind Morrison came more humans carrying what looked like primitive projectile weapons, instead of the energy rifles that civilized species used. They moved in formation without speaking, and their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings as if expecting an attack at any moment. Zekthara noticed that even in the safety of an allied vessel, the humans never seemed to fully relax. Morrison saluted in the human fashion, which looked awkward compared to the graceful Coalition greeting ritual. His voice was calm and professional, as he introduced his team and requested quarters for his soldiers. Zekthara assigned them to the lower decks, thinking it would be safer to keep the humans away from sensitive ship systems until he understood them better. Dr. Lisa Park was the human science officer, and she seemed different from the soldiers. She smiled more and asked questions about Coalition technology with genuine curiosity. When Zekthara showed her to the briefing room, she examined everything with the enthusiasm of a child seeing new toys. Her questions about Coalition military doctrine made him uncomfortable, though. She wanted to know about casualty rates and acceptable losses in previous campaigns. When Zekthara explained that the Coalition always tried to minimize deaths and would retreat rather than sacrifice lives unnecessarily, Park looked confused. She mentioned something called strategic retreats and acceptable casualties that made no sense to him. The Coalition fought to protect life, not to throw it away. The human soldiers spent their time checking and rechecking their weapons in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. They cleaned projectile rifles that fired metal slugs, instead of energy beams, and counted ammunition that would run out instead of recharging like proper weapons. Zekthara watched them through security cameras and noticed they laughed and told jokes while preparing for battle. This behavior disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Every other species in the Coalition prepared for combat with ceremonies and prayers and meditation to center their minds for the trials ahead. The humans acted like they were getting ready for routine maintenance work instead of facing an enemy that had destroyed entire fleets. Morrison requested a meeting with the senior staff to discuss tactics, and Zekthara reluctantly agreed. The human commander spread out maps and charts that looked hand-drawn instead of computer-generated. His proposed battle plans involved terms like flanking maneuvers and concentrated fire that sounded aggressive compared to the defensive strategies the Coalition normally used. When Zekthara asked about preserving their forces, Morrison looked at him strangely and said that forces were meant to be used, not preserved. The human explained that his species had been fighting wars for thousands of years and had learned that the best way to minimize casualties was to end conflicts as quickly and decisively as possible. The ship's other officers whispered among themselves about the humans and their strange attitudes toward warfare. Some found their confidence reassuring, while others worried about their apparent disregard for traditional military courtesy. Zekthara noticed that wherever the humans went, the atmosphere seemed to change and become more tense. As the Starbreaker approached the combat zone, Zekthara realized that he was about to discover whether the rumors about human military capabilities were true, or if his species had made a terrible mistake by trusting these strange beings with their lives. The Kthmore were waiting ahead, and soon everyone would learn what humans were really like when the shooting started. The joint fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, and Zekthara immediately saw how bad things had become. Civilian transport ships were fleeing toward the jump point, while Kthmore interceptors hunted them like pack animals chasing wounded prey. Explosions lit up the darkness of space as evacuation vessels died trying to escape with their precious cargo of refugees. Admiral Veltos appeared on the main screen from his flagship, and his normally calm demeanor showed cracks of strain. The enemy outnumbered their forces by more than 3-1 and held strategic positions throughout the system. Standard coalition doctrine called for a defensive screen to protect the civilian ships while they completed their evacuation, but even that seemed impossible against such overwhelming odds. Zekthara watched Morrison study the tactical display with an expression that reminded him of a technician examining a broken machine that needed fixing. The human commander asked questions about enemy fleet composition and defensive capabilities in the same tone someone might use to discuss repair procedures. There was no fear or excitement in his voice, just professional interest in the problem. Before him, Commander Morrison requested permission to implement what he called human tactics, and Admiral Veltos reluctantly agreed after seeing no other viable options. The human officer began issuing orders to his pilots that made no sense according to any military doctrine Zekthara had ever studied. He was telling them to fly directly into the strongest enemy formations instead of around them. Captain Danny Rodriguez acknowledged his orders with casual confidence that seemed inappropriate for what amounted to a suicide mission. His fighter squadron consisted of 12 small craft that looked primitive compared to coalition interceptors, but their pilots showed no hesitation as they accelerated toward the heart of the Kthmore battle line. Zekthara expected to watch them all die within minutes. Instead, he witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Rodriguez and his pilots flew their fighters with a reckless aggression that defied every rule of space combat. When their weapons ran out of ammunition, they used their ships themselves as weapons, ramming damaged fighters into Kthmore command vessels with devastating effect. They died, but they took critical enemy ships with them. The seemingly suicidal attack created gaps in the enemy formation that Morrison's main force exploited with surgical precision. Coalition officers watched in amazement as human heavy cruisers poured through the breaks in enemy lines and began destroying Kthmore ships from behind their own defensive screens. What had looked like desperate sacrifice turned out to be calculated. Tactical brilliance. Sergeant Amy Walsh led a boarding party onto a disabled Kthmore dreadnought, and Zekthara monitored their progress through helmet cameras that showed scenes from a nightmare. The corridors inside the enemy ship were dark and filled with smoke, and the sound of weapons fire echoed constantly through the metal passages. Coalition Marines had trained for boarding actions, but never in conditions like these. When Walsh's energy rifle malfunctioned in the ship's electromagnetic interference, she drew a knife and continued fighting in hand-to-hand combat. Zekthara watched in horror as she personally killed 3 Kthmore warriors with nothing but a blade and her bare hands. When her knife broke during a struggle with an enemy captain, she strangled him with her fingers while he tried to claw, her face off. The coalition Marines following her stopped moving and stared at what they had witnessed. They had seen other species fight before, but never with such personal violence, and never with such apparent comfort in close quarters killing. Walsh wiped blood from her hands and continued advancing toward the enemy bridge as if nothing unusual had happened. Morrison coordinated the overall battle from the Starbreaker's bridge, and his tactical decisions seemed to anticipate enemy responses before they happened. When Kthmore reinforcements arrived from the outer system, he had already positioned human ships to intercept them. When the enemy tried to retreat to a defensive position around the system's gas giant, he cut off their escape route with minefield deployments. Dr. Park explained to curious coalition officers that humans had been fighting wars against their own species for thousands of years and had developed tactics through constant practical application. She mentioned concepts like combined arms coordination and tactical flexibility that were foreign to species that had learned warfare from academic study rather than brutal experience. The battle lasted 8 hours and ended with the complete destruction or surrender of all Kthmore forces in the system. Coalition casualties were lighter than anyone had dared hope, while enemy losses were total and devastating. The civilian evacuation was completed successfully, and thousands of lives were saved that would have been lost under conventional tactics. As the last enemy ship surrendered or died, Zekthara realized that his understanding of warfare had been fundamentally changed. The humans had not just won a battle, they had demonstrated a completely different approach to military conflict. They fought not just to survive, but to dominate and destroy their enemies so completely that future resistance became impossible. Morrison filed his after-action report with the same professional calm he had shown throughout the engagement. His recommendations for future operations included suggestions for more aggressive tactics and closer integration between human and coalition forces. He spoke of the dead pilots in his squadron as acceptable losses incurred for tactical advantage, rather than heroes whose sacrifice should be mourned. The other coalition officers avoided making eye contact with the humans during the post-battle briefings, and Zekthara understood their discomfort. They had asked for help and received it, but the price of that help was seeing what their new allies were truly capable of when unleashed against an enemy. The humans had saved them all, but they had done it by being more ruthless and violent than anyone else on the battlefield. 3 days after their victory at Kepler 442, the Kthmore launched their response, and it was worse than anything the Coalition had imagined possible. Intelligence reports flooded in from across the front lines describing a new weapon that dissolved living tissue on contact. The bioweapon spread through the air like a virus but killed like acid eating through flesh and bone until nothing remained but empty clothes and screaming. Zekthara received the first casualty reports from the Arcturus defense stations and felt sick reading them. Entire crews had died in agony as their bodies melted away from the inside out. The lucky ones had died quickly when the weapon reached their vital organs, but others suffered for hours as it slowly consumed them piece by piece. Medical officers who tried to help the victims became victims themselves. The panic spread faster than the weapon itself as coalition forces began abandoning their positions rather than face such a horrible death. Admiral Veltos issued orders for full protective suits and sealed environments, but the bioweapon seemed to find ways through every defense they tried. Ships went silent as their crews died screaming, and space stations became floating tombs, filled with empty uniforms. Major Chris Bennett received the emergency briefing about the bioweapon while his human forces were resupplying at a coalition depot. He listened to the reports of mass casualties and spreading panic with the same calm expression he used for routine status updates. When asked about protective measures for his troops, he said they would continue normal operations with standard equipment. Dr. Park explained to horrified coalition medical officers that humans had evolved on what she called a death world, where countless diseases and toxins tried to kill them every day. Their immune systems were designed to fight off biological threats that would devastate species from safer planets. She showed them test results proving that human blood neutralized the Kthmore bioweapon within minutes of contact, while coalition forces evacuated entire sectors to escape the spreading death. Humans advanced through areas that their allies could no longer enter. Bennett's soldiers walked through toxic clouds that had killed thousands of alien warriors without even wearing breathing masks. They set up forward bases in contaminated zones and used them to launch attacks on Kthmore positions. The enemy had expected their bioweapon to clear the battlefield of all resistance, but instead found themselves facing an opponent that seemed immune to their most feared weapon. Human forces pressed their advantage and began systematic attacks on bioweapon production facilities. They fought in environments so toxic that coalition support was impossible, but they seemed to thrive in conditions that killed everything else. Colonel Linda Hayes received classified intelligence from human spy networks that operated behind enemy lines using methods the coalition preferred not to know about. The information revealed that the Kthmore were preparing to deploy quantum bombs, capable of erasing entire star systems from existence. These weapons could destroy not just matter and energy, but the underlying fabric of space and time itself. Coalition High Command immediately began preparing for full evacuation when they learned about the quantum weapons. The technology was beyond anything they had encountered before, and there was no known defense against weapons that could make entire solar systems cease to have ever existed. Veltos issued orders for all civilian populations in threatened areas to begin immediate relocation to safer regions. Hayes requested that all available human forces be concentrated for a preemptive strike against the quantum weapon facilities. Her plan called for simultaneous attacks on multiple targets, using tactics that coalition officers described as impossible. She wanted to assault fortified positions that were protected by the bioweapon clouds while under bombardment from conventional Kthmore fleets. Zekthara attended the planning session where Hayes outlined her strategy and found himself disturbed by her casual attitude toward what amounted to a suicide mission. She discussed acceptable casualty rates and mission success, probabilities with the same professional detachment that Morrison had shown during previous battles. The humans seemed to view their own deaths as tactical resources to be expended for strategic advantage. The coalition officers tried to suggest alternative approaches that might preserve more lives, but Hayes dismissed their concerns with explanations about military necessity and strategic priorities. She mentioned that human forces had trained for exactly this type of mission and were equipped to operate in environments that would kill their allies. Her confidence was unshakable, despite odds that seemed hopeless. Dr. Park provided technical briefings about human biological adaptations that allowed them to survive in hostile environments. She explained that human soldiers carried medical treatments specifically designed to counteract exotic weapons and had genetic modifications that improved their resistance to environmental hazards. The coalition medical staff listened in amazement to descriptions of deliberate biological enhancements. The human preparations for the quantum weapon assault differed from coalition standards in ways that made Zekthara increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of detailed battle plans and careful coordination, the humans seemed to rely on individual initiative and adaptive tactics. They spoke about improvising solutions to unexpected problems rather than following predetermined procedures. Bennett briefed his unit commanders about the mission parameters, and Zekthara monitored their discussions through communication intercepts. The humans talked about the quantum weapons as if they were just another type of enemy fortification to be destroyed rather than existential threats to galactic civilization. Their calm acceptance of impossible odds suggested either incredible bravery or complete insanity. As the human forces prepared for departure, Zekthara realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Every other species would retreat from weapons that could erase them from existence, but humans were charging directly toward the source of ultimate destruction. They faced extinction-level threats not with fear or despair, but with the methodical preparation of professional soldiers doing their job. The last communication from Hayes before her forces entered the quantum weapon zones contained a simple message that would haunt Zekthara for years afterward. She said that humans had learned long ago that some threats were too dangerous to be allowed to exist, and that the only solution was complete destruction, regardless of the cost. The transmission ended, and the coalition waited to learn whether their human allies would save them all or die trying. The battle for the Centaurus gate began when the first quantum bombs detonated and reality itself started coming apart at the seams. Zekthara watched through long-range sensors as sections of space simply ceased to exist, leaving holes in the universe that hurt to look at. Kthmore scientists had found a way to weaponize the fundamental forces that held existence together and were using them to delete their enemies from history. Coalition ships caught in the quantum fields experienced fates worse than destruction. Some vessels aged thousands of years in seconds until they crumbled into cosmic dust, while others were frozen in temporal loops that trapped their crews in eternal moments of terror. The lucky ships were simply erased completely, leaving no trace that they had ever been built or crewed by living beings. Commander Rick Santos led his human task force directly toward the primary quantum platform, despite witnessing what had happened to previous attackers. His ship, the Freedom's Edge, was a converted cargo hauler that looked primitive compared to coalition warships, but it carried weapons and equipment that were specifically designed for this type of assault. Santos had volunteered for the mission, knowing that survival was impossible. The quantum storm surrounding the Kthmore platform caught Santos's ship when he was still 3 kilometers from his target. Zekthara watched in horror as sections of the Freedom's Edge began aging at different rates, creating a patchwork of new construction and ancient decay across the hull. The ship's structure warped and twisted as time flowed differently in various compartments, but Santos kept flying toward his objective. Inside the dying vessel, Santos ordered his crew to begin manual detonation procedures for their fusion reactor while reality twisted around them. Some crew members had aged into elderly versions of themselves, while others remained young, creating a surreal scene of temporal chaos. The humans continued working, despite watching their friends become strangers, transformed by accelerated time, or locked in temporal stasis. Santos broadcast targeting data to human artillery positions until the moment his ship's reactor went critical inside the quantum field. The explosion created a feedback loop that tore through the artificial space-time distortions and destroyed the quantum platform in a cascade of collapsing energy fields. The commander died along with his entire crew, but their sacrifice eliminated one of the enemy's most dangerous weapons. Captain Melissa Brooks volunteered for what the humans called a forlorn hope, which was a military term for missions with no possibility of survival. Her assignment was to destroy the main quantum weapon facility by piloting a ship loaded with antimatter directly into its core. The approach required flying through multiple layers of defensive systems while under fire from conventional Kthmore fleets. Brooks flew alone in a modified fighter craft that had been stripped of everything except engines, weapons, and the largest antimatter warhead that human engineers could build. Her ship was too small for proper life support systems and too fast for escape pods, which meant that she was committed to the mission from the moment of launch. Other human pilots had volunteered for the same assignment, but Brooks had the best chance of success. The journey to the target took her through a nightmare landscape of twisted space, where the laws of physics changed without warning. Her ship's hull began dissolving in some areas, while other sections became harder than diamond due to localized quantum effects. Brooks continued flying and broadcasting telemetry data even as her vessel disintegrated around her piece by piece. Zekthara monitored her final approach through communication relays and heard her calm, professional voice reporting tactical information, while her life support systems failed and her controls stopped responding. She manually guided her craft using emergency thrusters while breathing recycled air that was slowly poisoning her. Her last transmission contained precise targeting coordinates for the quantum facility's reactor core. The antimatter explosion when Brooks's ship reached its destination created a brief artificial star that outshone the system's primary sun. The blast vaporized the quantum weapon facility and damaged several nearby Kthmore installations, but more importantly, it demonstrated something that shocked both sides of the conflict. Humans were willing to weaponize their own deaths to achieve military objectives. Coalition officers who witnessed the attack spoke in whispered conversations about what they had seen. Other species might sacrifice themselves to save their families or their worlds, but humans seemed to approach suicide missions with the same professional calculation they used for any other military operation. They died not in moments of heroic inspiration, but as part of carefully planned tactical maneuvers. The Kthmore response to these attacks revealed their growing fear of their human opponents. Intelligence intercepts showed enemy commanders discussing the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that seemed immune to their most terrifying weapons. The bioweapons had failed, and now their quantum bombs were being destroyed by opponents who flew into them deliberately. Dr. Park analyzed the enemy communications and reported that Kthmore morale was collapsing as their soldiers realized they were fighting beings that could not be intimidated or deterred by any level of threat. She explained that human military doctrine was based on the principle that any weapon could be countered by sufficient determination and acceptable casualties. The aliens had never faced an opponent with that philosophy. As news of the successful attacks spread through human forces, their soldiers began showing an enthusiasm for combat that disturbed their coalition allies. They spoke about the next mission with anticipation rather than dread, and seemed energized by the opportunity to face impossible odds. Their attitude suggested that they found meaning and purpose in confronting extinction-level threats. Kthmore filed classified reports about human combat effectiveness that would reshape coalition military doctrine for generations. He wrote that humans did not fight wars to survive them but to end them permanently regardless of personal cost. They had transformed suicide into a tactical weapon and death into a strategic resource that could be deployed with devastating effectiveness against any opponent. The battle for Centaurus Gate ended with complete human victory and total Kthmore retreat from the sector, but the cost in human lives had been enormous. Every successful mission had required someone to die, and the humans had provided those volunteers with calm professionalism. They mourned their dead, but they celebrated their victories and immediately began preparing for the next impossible mission that someone would not survive. The Kthmore had one final weapon in their arsenal, and it was older than their civilization. Deep in the void between stars, something ancient had been sleeping for millions of years, waiting for the psychic call that would awaken it to feed again. The enemy scientists activated forgotten technology and sent a signal into the darkness that should have remained undisturbed forever. The entity that answered their call existed in the space between thoughts and fed on consciousness itself. It had no physical form that normal minds could understand, but its presence could be felt as a cold touch on the soul that slowly drained away memory, identity, and sanity. Entire species had vanished without trace when they had encountered it, in the distant past. Kthmore felt the thing's influence creeping through his mind like ice water flowing through his veins. His memories began to fade, starting with the most recent and working backward through his life. Names and faces of friends became strangers, and important events lost their meaning until he could barely remember who he was or why he was on a warship, surrounded by beings he no longer recognized. Coalition crews throughout the fleet experienced the same mental dissolution as the Consciousness Eater began its feast. Some officers forgot how to operate their equipment, while others lost the ability to speak or understand language. The lucky ones fell into catatonic states while others became violent as their personalities collapsed into primitive fragments, driven by fear and pain. General Ryan Clark received reports about the spreading mental plague and immediately ordered all human vessels to implement what he called Protocol Omega. Kthmore watched through security cameras as calm, professional human soldiers began changing into something that made his remaining sanity recoil in terror. They were releasing emotional controls that he had not known existed. The transformation was subtle at first, but became more obvious as human crew members stopped following normal behavioral patterns. They moved differently with predatory grace that reminded Zekethera of hunting animals stalking prey. Their voices changed tone, and their eyes developed a quality that made other species instinctively want to run away and hide. Private Katie Johnson had been partially consumed by the consciousness Eater before Protocol Omega took effect, and her mind was a battlefield between alien influence and human rage. She spoke in fragments about hunting the thing that was trying to eat her thoughts, and began setting traps using her own memories as bait to lure the entity into psychological ambushes. Johnson moved through the ship's corridors with purpose that seemed disconnected from rational thought, but proved devastatingly effective against their invisible enemy. She would stand in certain locations and think specific thoughts that acted like poison to the consciousness eater when it tried to consume them. Her damaged mind had become a weapon that could hurt something that existed beyond physical reality. Other human soldiers began displaying similar behaviors as they adapted to fighting an opponent that attacked through dreams and memories rather than conventional weapons. They developed tactics that made no sense to outside observers, but seemed to work by turning their own mental processes into defensive barriers and offensive weapons against the entity. Dr. Park explained to remaining Coalition personnel that human minds contained psychological structures that had evolved during millions of years of predatory existence on their death world. She said that humans had learned to think like hunters, even in their sleep, and that those thought patterns were toxic to beings that tried to consume human consciousness without understanding its true nature. The consciousness eater had expected to find the same type of organized, civilized minds that it had devoured from other species, but instead encountered something that had been shaped by constant violence and survival pressure. Human thoughts contained defensive mechanisms that triggered when threatened, and those mechanisms included the capacity for directed hatred that could burn through psychic attacks. Zekethera witnessed Johnson track the entity through the ship using methods that defied explanation. She would stand in empty rooms and have conversations with shadows while her eyes tracked movement that no one else could see. Her partially consumed mind seemed able to perceive the consciousness eater in ways that intact minds could not manage. Though human soldiers began coordinating their attacks against the invisible enemy using communication methods that bypassed normal language entirely. They shared information through emotional states and behavioral cues that created a collective hunting consciousness focused on destroying their opponent. The entity found itself being hunted by minds that were designed to kill things that tried to kill them. General Clark monitored the battle through reports that read like documentation of mass insanity, but proved effective against an enemy that conventional weapons could not touch. His soldiers were using their own psychological damage as weapons and their anger as ammunition in a conflict that was being fought inside their heads rather than in physical space. The turning point came when Johnson managed to corner the consciousness eater in what she described as a memory maze built from her own traumatic experiences. She had weaponized her pain and used it to create a psychological trap that held the entity while other humans attacked it with focused hatred that seemed to cause it actual injury. Coalition officers who were still capable of rational thought watched in amazement as the human assault drove back an opponent that had been consuming their minds with impunity. The entity began retreating from human thoughts and seeking easier prey among species whose mental defenses had not been forged in the fires of evolutionary violence. The consciousness eater made its final mistake when it tried to consume the memories of a human sergeant who had survived multiple tours of combat duty on his home world. His mind contained experiences of violence and horror that were so intense they functioned like mental poison to a being that fed on consciousness. The entity recoiled in what might have been pain or disgust. Zekethera felt his own memories returning, as the creature's influence weakened and fled back toward the void between stars. The human soldiers gradually returned to their normal behavior patterns, but their eyes retained a quality that suggested the savage hunters were still present just beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon again. Dr. Park filed a report stating that the Consciousness Eater had been successfully repelled, but at the cost of revealing aspects of human psychology that might be disturbing to their allies. She recommended that Protocol Omega never be implemented except in cases of absolute necessity, because the humans it unleashed were barely recognizable as the same species that had joined the coalition as peaceful partners. The Consciousness Eater retreated into the dark spaces between stars, carrying wounds that would take millennia to heal, and memories of prey that fought back with psychological weapons more terrifying than its own hunger. The ancient entity had learned that some minds were too dangerous to consume, and some species too violent to be safely approached. It would not answer calls from the Kthmore again. The Kthmore surrender came 3 days later when their remaining commanders realized they had exhausted every weapon in their arsenal without achieving anything except teaching their enemies new ways to kill them. Their unconditional capitulation included terms that would prevent them from developing military technology for the next 1,000 years and required them to submit to human oversight of their weapons research. Admiral Zekethara filed his after-action report with Coalition Command and found himself struggling to find words that could adequately describe what he had witnessed. He wrote that humans were not merely another species that happened to be good at warfare, but something fundamentally different that had evolved specifically to end threats permanently, regardless of the personal cost to themselves. The report classified humans as a Death World apex species and recommended special diplomatic protocols for all future interactions with them. Zekethara noted that while other coalition members had evolved to survive in their environments, humans had evolved to make everything else in their environment not survive. The distinction was critical for understanding their approach to conflict. Resolution. Coalition military doctrine underwent complete restructuring based on human tactical principles and strategic thinking. The old defensive strategies that emphasized preserving lives and minimizing casualties were replaced with aggressive doctrines focused on ending conflicts quickly and decisively. Human advisors began training coalition officers in concepts like acceptable losses and strategic sacrifice. Dr. Park addressed the Galactic Council in a closed session that would remain classified for the next century. She explained that humanity had been deliberately restraining their military capabilities during their membership evaluation period because they understood that their true nature might be disturbing to species that had not evolved through constant warfare. The revelation that humans had been holding back their full potential caused panic among some council members who realized that the species they had welcomed as junior partners could have conquered the entire galaxy before anyone understood the threat they represented. Human technology was not primitive but deliberately simplified to avoid alarming their new allies. Park showed classified footage of human weapons testing that had been conducted in remote systems far from Coalition space. The demonstrations included planet-killing weapons that could sterilize entire worlds and stellar engineering projects that could cause suns to go nova on command. Humanity possessed the ability to wage war on a galactic scale if they chose to do so. The Council debates about human military capabilities continued for months as representatives tried to understand the implications of having apex predators as allies instead of enemies. Some species called for immediate restrictions on human weapons development, while others argued that humanity's restraint proved they could be trusted with their dangerous abilities. Zekethara testified before the Council about his personal observations of human combat behavior and found himself defending the species that had saved his life and his civilization. He explained that humans did not fight wars for conquest or resources, but to permanently eliminate threats to themselves and their allies. Their violence was purposeful rather than sadistic. The final Council resolution established humanity as the Coalition's primary military force with authority to implement whatever tactics they deemed necessary for galactic defense. The other Species would continue to provide technological and logistical support, but humans would make all strategic decisions regarding warfare. It was the only practical arrangement given their demonstrated superiority. General Clark accepted his new position as Supreme Military Commander of Coalition forces with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the war. His first official act was to establish training programs that would teach other species human military principles while respecting their cultural limitations regarding acceptable casualties and strategic sacrifice. The human military academies that opened across Coalition space attracted students from every member species, despite the disturbing nature of the curriculum. Young aliens learned about concepts like total war and acceptable losses that their cultures had never needed to develop. The education was necessary for understanding how to fight alongside humans. Kthmore enrolled in the First Joint Command course and found himself studying military history that read like horror stories to his sensibilities. Human warfare had involved deliberate targeting of civilian populations, industrial capacity, and agricultural resources to break enemy will to continue fighting. They had learned to wage war against entire civilizations rather than just their military forces. The course materials included case studies of human conflicts that demonstrated their species' capacity for sustained violence over multiple generations. Some wars had continued for centuries, with each side developing new weapons and tactics in response to enemy innovations. Humans had been fighting themselves for so long that combat was embedded in their cultural DNA. Dr. Park's final report to the Council contained a warning that would influence human relations with other species for generations to come. She wrote that humanity represented a unique evolutionary path that had produced apex predators capable of rational thought and technological development. They were not inherently evil, but they were inherently dangerous. The report concluded with an observation that haunted Kthmore whenever he remembered it. Park noted that humans did not see war as an unfortunate necessity or a failure of diplomacy, but as a profession that some of them were very good at performing. They had turned the business of killing into an art form that they practiced with pride and dedication. In his personal log, Kthmore wrote his final thoughts about the species that had saved his civilization and changed his understanding of what it meant to survive in a hostile universe. He noted that humans were not warriors who fought for glory or honor, but soldiers who fought because war was their job and they were extremely competent at their work. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing in a universe, full of wonders and horrors, was not an ancient evil or cosmic disaster, but a species that looked at extinction and said, "Not today." Humans had earned their place among the stars, not through wisdom or compassion, but through their absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when facing impossible odds. Coalition space was safer now because humanity stood guard at its borders. But Kthmore sometimes wondered if they had traded one type of danger for another. The species that protected them from external threats might themselves be the most dangerous thing in the galaxy if they ever decided that their allies had become enemies instead.